Hello and welcome to the Kemetic How-To Guide for Egyptian pagan and Kemetic practitioners. I'm your host, Sharon, and we are finishing up our series on tearing apart Egyptian magic, ancient Egyptian magic, by Eleanor Harris. And again, that's because I read this book. Someone was kind enough to ask me about this book if I had read it, and it seemed like it was something helpful to them, but I picked this up and it was just so bad as I read through it. I said, you know what, I need to talk about some of these things, and it has launched a 3-part series, which we're finishing up now. We're going to talk about Heka, which is the Egyptian word for magic, and the Greek magical papyri. What are those? I'll explain in a moment. Now, after this book slapdashes its way through Egyptian religious beliefs, the clergy and their hierarchy and ritual garb, then it spends the rest of its pages on magic. For one thing, what strikes me is, and it's not limited to this book, but it seems that so many people, when they get started in, the craft, paganism, the occult, whatever, they don't want to take faith in the old gods. They want to learn to work magic. And that's what these kind of books are all about, as they are aiming it at the rank and file that just want to learn magic. Well, apparently nobody wanted to do research either. First of all, there's several little tidbits in here that, it's just a string, and they're just good anecdotes for what struck me when I was reading this. On page 93, the beginning of chapter 4, it cites something in ancient Egyptian at the top, Ma'acheru, and translates it as he who realizes his word. No, that's not what it means. Ma'acheru means true of voice, ma'ah meaning true, and acheru, the voice. Generally, that was used to refer to someone who had died and was found worthy in the Hall of Two Truths. You'll hear it translated as vindicated in a lot of, scholarly works. That's what it means. It does not mean what she says it does. But getting beyond the little things like that, most of the spells that she cites in here come from a work called the Leiden Papyrus. What she doesn't relate is that technically the Leiden Papyrus is only half the document. And worst of all, there are little bits that she leaves out in here.
Of all the circuit glitch diode blowing dimwittery, you left a piece out.
Now, don't get me wrong. It's okay, I do this sometimes myself, citing an excerpt from an ancient source. If you say this is taken from such and such source and give the original, reference, as long as you tell people this is what you're doing, and as long as you don't take something out that's going to change the meaning. And certain things that she left out of here are rather important. We'll discuss that in a minute. But let's explore the full scope of these magical sources that she's drawing from. What are some challenges in understanding and utilizing them? And finally, what might be some better strategies for those of you that are interested in practicing Egyptian magic? So first of all, what is the London-Leiden Papyrus? That story kind of gets into the early days of Egyptology, and there were some real scoundrels and scallywags in the early days of archaeology. One of them was a gentleman named Jean d'Anastasi. Sounds French, but they think he was actually Armenian. They don't even know what year he was born, but he managed to put himself in the right place at the right time in Egypt in order to buy a whole bunch of papyri that were supposedly found in Thebes. That's where we think they were from. And then he auctioned them off to different museums in Europe. One of these documents was bought by the Leiden Museum in Holland in about 1828, and there was another one that was part of his personal collection that was sold off when he died in 1857, and it was bought by the British Museum in London. several years after that, and we're talking like a couple of decades, I believe it was, somebody starts studying the London document, which had a name. It was, Papyrus Anastasi, with a number to it. And they said, wait a minute. They went and they talked to somebody who took care of had studied the Leiden document, and when they looked at copies, they figured out they were part of the same document. Somewhere along the way, somebody, we don't know who, it could have been in modern times, it could have been earlier, but somebody tore the scroll in half. And, yes, as horrifying as that is, that's pretty tame compared to what's happened to some ancient, artifacts. In the early days, people really didn't treat these things the way they needed to be. But somewhere along the way, it got split up, so one half is in London, the other half is in Leiden. And scholars started to figure this out. They noticed they had the same handwriting, and the subject matter goes from one to the next, rather seamlessly. So they have been published together as the London-Leiden Papyrus. Now, you can buy a translation of the London-Leiden Papyrus. This is a reprint of a fairly old translation, but it's a very good one. If you get this, it's very handy if you're trying to kind of build your own magic or hymns or things of the sort. And it's under the imprint Forgotten Books, because this was an old manuscript that they reprinted, and you can get it on Amazon for really cheap. I think this was under $10. So if you're looking for ancient sources, here you go. Here's a pretty handy one, and it's got a lot of like that kind of quick and dirty sort of information. Like there's one spell that says you should do it when the foreleg, which is the Big Dipper, when that constellation is in a certain spot, and that kind of information is rather handy to know if you're trying to work Heka. That being said, it's actually part of a broader corpus that is abbreviated PGM. What is that? That is the Papyri Graeca Magica, and there's also the Papyri Demotica Magica, or PDM. Both of those are collections of documents, and it's not all housed in one place. They're all over, but it's like a category of papyrus documents that contain magic, and they were written in either Greek or Demotic. There are also some written in Old Coptic, and to my knowledge, those have not been published yet. There might be some that are being worked on now. That's another interesting thing about archaeology, is that there are lots of things sitting in dusty storerooms and back rooms in museums and university collections outside of Egypt, and you could do a lot of good studying those if you wanted to go into Egyptology as a discipline, and you could find a lot of interesting things and never go to Egypt to study them. You could be digging up stuff in the back storerooms. But there's also a long story about how the Greek magical papyri were worked on, and this was a project that went over several people's lifetimes, and it was interrupted by World War I and World War II, and negatives and things being from manuscripts being destroyed, and then other things being saved. That's kind of a story in and of itself. But the Greek magical papyri in translation, this book is a little more expensive. I think it was $30 or $40, but this is really worth it. The contents of the London-Leiden Papyrus are in here, but so is a lot of other stuff. What's really interesting about the Greek magical papyri is that, yes, there's lots of Egyptian references in there, but there's also invocations to Selene, to Hecate. There's references to Ereshkigal, who is a Sumerian goddess of the underworld that's, mention of her survived into Hellenistic times. And that's when all this stuff dates from. It's from the last couple of centuries BC up to about 300 AD. So we're dealing with the last few centuries of paganism, and there's very much a melting pot. There's references to, Judeo-Christian figures in here, but there's also stuff that is very, very much rooted in Egyptian religious tradition. And if you want to understand magic as they might have been practicing it at that time, then you definitely want to get a copy of this. This includes the demotic spells. This is the second edition, volume 1. There's a volume of texts, and then there's a volume that's commentary. And it is edited by Hans-Dieter Betz. And so look for that. It's a wonderful resource. I have lots of pages dog-eared in here. So again, a lot of the things that she mentions here I recognize because I was like, oh, I could find the page in here that it was drawn from. Now, if you're trying to study Egyptian sources and you want to kind of go before the Hellenistic period, because it was such a melting pot, there's a couple of other sources I recommend, and they're fairly easy to get a hold of. The first one, Ancient Egyptian Magical Texts by J.F. Bourgut. Now, I have it in a binder here because the actual book is very small. And I was able to acquire it through interlibrary loan. University in another part of my state had it, and they sent it to me, and the book is small enough that you can stick it in a copier and get 2 pages. So the whole book is, about like that. And, I Xeroxed the whole book, basically. And so, let me see if I can find out how many pages it is. Okay, about 125 pages, so not very long. You could spend a few bucks at a copy place, and, after you get it through interlibrary loan, send it back early, and you have a whole bunch of Egyptian texts that date from the Pharaonic era. And they all have to deal with magic. And actually, I've cited a few of them in one of my books. Circle of the Sun does have a chapter dealing with Heka and Ancient Egyptian Magical Texts by J.F. Bourgut. That was one of my sources. Another of my sources you can actually get for free, and that is The Mechanics of Ancient Egyptian Magical Practice by Robert K. Rittner. This was his doctoral dissertation, and I get the sense that he was a shoo-in when he, presented and defended this thesis, because it has been referred to in citations in so many other works, and it really kind of opened up the world on explaining some of the basics, mechanics, the techniques of ancient Egyptian magic. Things like, breaking pottery, spitting, knot tying, various things like that, burning things, what kinds of spells did they do them in and what did it mean? The best part of all is you can get it for free on the University of Chicago's Oriental Institute website. I'll give you the link. You just go in there and you tell them, no, I'm not trying to redistribute it, I'm using it for personal research, and you can download it as a PDF. So if you want to understand Egyptian magic, download that, read it, be better for it. So those are some scholarly sources that you can read, and one of them will kind of explain to you in very simple terms, this is what these techniques mean. As for Ancient Egyptian Magic, which is written from a pagan perspective, our illustrious author gives you several spells without really explaining any of the backstory behind them, if you will. A really good example, there's a spell that is a charm for divination that she gives. In the Greek magical Papyri, it's translated as a phylactery. There were actually several spells that involved a phylactery, basically a means of protection for you when you go to, do some kind of divination or invoke a spirit or whatever. Well, in this one, it involves tying cords of different colors, which kind of makes me think of a friendship bracelet. In the original, it says to drown a scarab beetle and then wrap it in fine linen. Drowning, of course, was meant to deify or to identify with Osiris, the unfortunate animal that, you drown. And there are a couple of, I know at least one spell in this collection that involves drowning a cat. And most of us today, I would hope, would blanch at the very idea of doing that. But in ancient times, apparently there were some people who, didn't mind so much about, killing a poor animal, And that's kind of a difference between then and now. And she doesn't really spend enough time or spell out clearly enough, in my opinion, that this is a difference between the magic that we do and what was done back then. The other thing that's in that particular spell that she doesn't mention, in the original, you're also supposed to take that cord and stain it with the blood of a type of bird called a hoopoe. And that's a real bird. You can Google, what a hoopoe is, and apparently it was associated with divinities or with, magical properties by peoples in the Middle East. It may have been a symbol of the sun god, don't know. But this animal's blood had a ritual significance when you stain your amulet with it. In here, she says to use some of your own blood. Well, okay. There's nothing wrong with using your own blood for something in terms of ethics. You're not killing another animal or something, but the problem is that could change the function of the spell, the amulet at that point. And that's a kind of a major change that she does in here, and she doesn't really explain that to you. And the reason why I caught it is because I happened to recognize the original from, the Greek magical Papyri book. That's the sort of thing that's, it's kind of important to know this. Another thing that she lists in here, and she follows the directions in the original spell fairly closely. It involves taking a plant called the Greek bean, and you bury it in a vessel, and you store it away for 40 days, and the description says that when you dig it back up, it's going to look like, testicles and scrotum. And then you bury it again, and it's going to, when you dig it up again, it'll look bloody. Well, it's probably going to look like a bloody scrotum because it's rotting. It's fermenting. And then the spell says you take that mix, and then you smear it on your eyes. No, don't do this. You don't know what's going on with that thing, and I certainly would try and put that on my eyes. Maybe as it's fermenting, it creates some kind of chemicals that it's psychotropic or hallucinogenic or something, and that's going to help you with your divination, I'm sure. Don't do that, please. Don't do it. But that's the sort of thing that she's relating in here without really thinking about it. I don't know. That's what really made me go, what the, with this. One other issue that I have with this book, she does relate, again, it's fairly faithful. She's stating a fact, basically. In a lot of ancient spells, the person who is to be reading the spell and, taking on an authoritative voice saying that they are speaking as so-and-so, to get an effect for healing or whatever, they threaten that if they don't get the result they want, then they will do something that is ritually taboo. Or to say, if you don't, do this for me, then I will go to, a town that was sacred to Osiris and burn up his body, or his relics. That's something else that nowadays I would not recommend anybody try to do. But she says, hey, they did it, so it must be okay, right? No. This is where I say that we have the benefit of hindsight, looking back on magic as it was practiced 2,000 years ago. It's funny, they didn't know it at the time that they were writing all of this down, but that happened to be at the very end of the pagan era, and there was this new religion called Christianity that started spreading across the Roman Empire and driving underground all of these practices that were being written down. And we're lucky to have what we still do because of that. It seems to me that maybe these spells that threatened negative consequences against the deities themselves might have been opening up psychic doorways that didn't need to be opened and created, vulnerabilities, if you think about it, in the psychic world. And, who knows, maybe that magic backfired and we don't have the record of that. All we have is the record of their instructions that they were reading. So that's why I don't think we should slavishly copy that part of ancient practices. Now, another thing that she spends a little time talking about in here is she calls it shape-shifting. And that's very similar to the idea of assuming the god form, which is done in the ancient Egyptian Book of Shadows. And, again, the techniques are fairly similar, and this is something that certain groups do, but it's also something that I do not recommend anybody try to do. Not because you can't. Yeah, you can astrally project and, take on, a different form. But in the process, you're opening up psychic doorways, as I, mentioned earlier, and you're making yourself vulnerable to psychic attack at that point. And I don't care what kind of a magical or psychic badass you think you are. The more of this kind of stuff that you do, and the more you delve into that world, you're putting energy out there, and you're kind of lighting a big beacon that says, here I am. And it's going to attract things. Not all of them are going to be positive. And this is an issue that I had with the Egyptian Book of Shadows. They said, oh, well, if you do some certain tests or you question a spirit, then you can compel them to say who they are. And no, you could have something come and blindside you, and I'm speaking from experience on some of this stuff. I get the strong sense that this author and the author of those other books never woke up screaming in the middle of the night and with the lights on was praying for sunrise. Been there, done that, I don't want the t-shirt. So that's why I don't recommend doing that. Also, partly because one of the biggest things that these books don't tell you is that the physical world and the spiritual world are connected. And if you believe that tying knots, casting salt, burning incense, all of these things that are physical and involve material objects can have a spiritual effect, then you're acknowledging there is a link between the spiritual world and the material world. And we as human beings are at the fulcrum point of those two worlds. That being said, think about the turmoil and the chaos that's going on in our physical world right now. You don't think that has some effect on the spiritual world too? If it's not safe to go outside right now because you're worried about catching a virus, I don't think it's very safe to go play in astral land right now when there could be who knows what swirling around out there. And I'm not trying to be paranoid, I'm just saying don't take unnecessary risks even in your magical practice. The best thing to do is to work on the physical world. That is something that we're here and we have control over to a large degree. And that's what we're here for. Think of life in the physical world as one big research project, and we're going to take everything that we experience here and bring it with us when we move on to the next plane. And so that's why, if you really want your magic to be unassailable, 1, do your research, but 2, and most importantly, concentrate on your physical betterment, your physical self, and your place in the mundane world, because the mundane world still matters and still has an effect on the spiritual world. Remember, it's all connected. Make your, physical, your physical space, as good as it can be, and practice safe sex. With those thoughts in mind, for those of you who celebrate Thanksgiving, I hope you've had a good one at this point, and it's still kind of crazy out there. Just take care of yourselves. Thank you as always for watching, and I hope to see you next month. And in the meantime, Sanipti.
Enjoyed this video? Then be sure to hit like and subscribe to the Kemetic Independent channel. You can also buy my books on lulu.com and shop for pagan supplies in my Etsy store. Check the description for links. And special thanks to all my Patreon supporters. Join us for updates, outtakes, and exclusive videos only on Patreon.